Hi, in this video, I'm going to show you how to style terrain data with some of the interesting renderers that QGIS comes with. Okay, so here I have QGIS open and I've got the terrain layer loaded along with the study area boundary. And I'm going to open up the layer styling panel to begin working with that. And I can just click this little paintbrush icon in the layers panel or press F7 to open this up. And it usually opens up along the right-hand side of QGIS. And in the layer styling panel, we have the target layer here. So in this case, since I have terrain selected in the layers panel, it will be the one chosen in the layer styling panel. I can switch these a number of ways. So I can choose them from the layer panel or choose them from this drop-down menu. So terrain is my target layer, and by default, this data comes in styled with a single band gray color ramp, which styles it from black to white across the range of values. And we have these various stretch settings that we can use. So we can choose whole raster or current extent or updated canvas. And we can also choose to estimate the values or get the actual values, which takes a little bit more time. And so if you do that, you may see these values adjust. So we have a high value of just over 40 meters and a low value of just under 2 meters for our study area. So I'm going to start by choosing a different renderer other than single band gray. And if I click the drop down, you can see I have a number of choices. And I'm going to choose the hillshade renderer. So the hillshade renderer gives me a hillshade rendering of this data. And I can see down here I have a resampling section in my layer styling panel. And this is set to nearest neighbor for zoomed in and zoomed out. And you'll notice if you zoom into that data a little bit more closely, you start to see this kind of gridding, pixelating effect. And if we change the resampling method, we can smooth that out and get rid of those artifacts. So if I choose bilinear for zoomed in, it will smooth the rendering of this digital terrain data and creates a nicer visualization. So you often need to address the resampling when using the hillshade renderer. Now I'm going to right-click and duplicate this layer. And I'll rename this duplication DTM. And I'm going to rename this one above that I've used the hillshade renderer for the hillshade layer. So these are both being pulled from the same source, the same terrain data on my disk, but we're going to use two different renderers for these. So I'll turn off the hillshade layer, and with the DTM, I'm going to change the renderer from hillshade to single band pseudo color. So here it's going to choose a color ramp other than the black and white to style the data on, and if I click the drop down, you'll see that you have a number of color ramps that ship as favorites with QGIS, and if you click here, you'll see others beyond those. And you could certainly choose like brown to blue-green to get a different rendering. And with all of these, you can invert the color ramp. But here I want to choose one that's really specific to terrain. So I'm going to click the drop-down arrow for the color ramp and choose Create New Color Ramp. And when I do this, I have a number of choices. I could create my own gradient, which sometimes is preferable, but takes a bit of time. But I'm going to instead choose this catalog CPT City, which is a catalog of nicely developed color ramps that ships with QGIS. I'll click OK, and in a couple seconds, we'll get the catalog CPT City window open with a number of color ramps that we can choose from. And these are all organized according to type. So we have greens, grays, some are for bathymetry, temperature, and we see we have a topography section. So that's what I'm interested in. So here's a number of color ramps specifically for terrain. And two that I particularly like are either the SDA or the CDA color ramps. So I'll choose SDA for this demonstration and click OK, and it will style the terrain according to that SDA color ramp. And if I ever wanted to save this as a favorite for future applications, I can click the color ramp drop-down menu and choose Save Color Ramp. And I can give this a name. So I could just call it SDA in this case, or you could choose elevation or something more descriptive to you. And you can choose to add this to your favorites and give it other tags if you're interested in that, like topology, for example. Or that doesn't really make sense. Maybe I'd call it topography and create a new tag. So I can click Save to accept that. And now you'll notice when I click the color ramp menu, I will see that SDA in the list. So you can manage those color ramps as you need to. And now if I turn on the hillshade layer above it, I only see the layer on top. I see the hillshade, which is obscuring the DTM. But I can create a very nice hillshade effect by using either transparency or blending modes. So I'll show you transparency first, which is kind of the older way of doing this. If I shift to the transparency tab here and start adjusting the transparency of my hillshade, I will start to see the colors underneath. But you can see they're kind of muted. You don't see the full saturation of them, in other words. And as I increase this opacity, I see the colors more vividly, but I lose the detail in the hillshade. And usually there's a sweet spot with this slider somewhere around 70%, but you can see the colors are still kind of washed out and muted. So I'm going to put this back to 100% and show you the better way to achieve this effect, which is going back to the symbology tab of the layer styling panel and looking at the blending mode here under layer rendering. So we're going to choose a blending mode of multiply, which is the most commonly used blending mode in the suite of 13 blending modes that come with QGIS. And this is the most popular application of it, is creating a color hillshade effect where you're applying the blending mode to the uppermost layer, in this case hillshade, so it blends it with the colors of the layer below, in this case the DTM. And you can see we get the full saturation of the colors and all the detail in the hillshade simultaneously. I'll show you one more renderer here. I'm going to right click on hillshade and choose duplicate layer. And I'll drag this duplication to be the topmost of those three, and I'll rename it to contour. And I will turn this layer on, and right now it's completely duplicated, so I'm just turning on a second hillshade. And I will, instead of hillshade, choose contours as the renderer here. Here we have a contour interval of 100 and 500, and if you recall, our elevation ranges from 40 to 2. So this is way too large of an interval for us. So I'm going to reduce the contour interval down to something more reasonable, like 2. And the index contour is 5 times greater than the contour typically. It makes it easier to count the contour lines, and usually has a thicker symbol. So I'm going to go into here and give this a thicker symbol so that I can see those index contours a bit better. Sometimes with this renderer, you also need to reduce the input scaling with some data sets to see the contours. We didn't have to do that here, but I wanted to point that option out. If you're not seeing the contours, you may have to reduce that input downscaling option number. And here it adopted our multiply blending mode. So if I choose normal, we won't see too much of a difference. It looks very similar. But we can get some nicer, more subtle effects if we play around with some of the other blending modes in the list. For example, overlay, which kind of blends those with the colors of the terrain below and gives us the visibility of those contours, but makes them a little more subtle and blends them with the background a little bit. And there's a couple others here that you can experiment with. There's soft light and difference. And all of these kind of create a subtle blending of those contours below. So you can choose which one you like. But then we get a really nice color hillshade with contours of our terrain. And we didn't have to create any data. That's what I like about these renderers, is that you can very quickly set them up and just based on that one layer have 3 renderings of it that really create a much nicer map than we would have just with the black to white elevation.